The car outside the hotel had already left, and Claire Whitfield stood alone on the cold pavement, with her heart pounding, for no reason she could explain. It was 7 minutes past 8. The sky was black, and somewhere behind those tall glass doors, 1,000 candles were burning for a party she was not sure she belonged at. She pressed her invitation card against her chest, as if it might slip out of her hand and vanish into the wind. This was supposed to be the year everything changed. She had promised herself that after 5 New Year's Eves spent watching other people's happiness through a screen, she would finally walk into a room and claim a place in it. Claire was 31 years old, and loneliness had become such a familiar companion that she sometimes forgot to notice it anymore, the way a person stops hearing a clock ticking in their own home. She worked long hours at a design firm in the city. She had 2 good friends who called occasionally, and she had a mother who worried about her from 300 miles away. But on nights like this, when the whole world seemed to be pairing off into couples and laughing groups, Claire felt the old ache return, sharp and familiar, like a wound that never fully closed. She had almost not come. Her friend Nora had bought her the ticket weeks earlier, insisting that Claire could not spend another New Year's Eve curled up on her sofa with a blanket and a bowl of soup, watching fireworks explode over a city she was too tired to join. Nora had a way of pushing people gently until they moved, and this time it had worked. Claire had bought a dress, a deep green one that made her feel almost brave, and she had told herself the whole drive over that this year would be different. Now, standing at the entrance, she was already losing her nerve. Inside, the ballroom glittered like something from a dream she was not sure she had earned. Chandeliers dropped soft golden light over round tables dressed in white cloth, and waiters moved between them with trays of champagne that caught the light like liquid glass. A band played somewhere near the far wall, low and warm, filling the space with music that seemed to promise something wonderful was about to happen to somebody in that room. Claire handed her coat to the attendant and stepped further inside, smoothing the front of her dress with hands that would not stop trembling. She scanned the room for a friendly face and found none. Every table seemed to already have its story written, its laughter established, its warmth closed like a door. Groups of friends leaned toward each other with the easy familiarity of people who had shared 100 nights like this one. Couples stood close, their fingers linked, their heads tilted toward each other in private conversation. Claire moved through the crowd slowly, smiling at no one in particular, trying to look like a woman who had somewhere to be, rather than a woman searching desperately for any place at all. She checked her small clutch bag again for the folded paper with her table number on it. Nora had promised to meet her here, but Nora's message from 20 minutes earlier said she was stuck in traffic outside the city and might be very late. Claire read the message twice, feeling the small hope she had been carrying begin to shrink. She was, for all purposes, alone in a room built for people who were not alone. A waiter passed with a tray, and Claire took a glass of champagne simply to have something to hold. The bubbles caught in her throat as she sipped, more from nerves than from actual pleasure of the drink. She found her way toward the edge of the room where the tables gave way to open floor space, and she stood there, watching, the way a person watches a party they were invited to, but were never quite meant to attend. Somewhere near the center of the room, a long table stretched beneath a banner of white and gold, clearly reserved for guests of importance. Claire noticed it the way anyone notices something grand and distant, without much thought, without imagining it would matter to her at all. She had no idea, standing there with a champagne glass sweating in her hand, that a man seated at that very table had already turned his head in her direction and was watching her with quiet, careful attention. Claire found an usher near the entrance to the dining hall and showed him her folded paper with the table number written on it, in Nora's careful handwriting. The usher frowned, checked a list on a small tablet, checked it again, and then looked up at her with an expression she recognized instantly, the look of someone about to deliver news they did not want to deliver. "There is no seat under this number," he said gently. "It seems there was a mistake with the booking. I am very sorry." Claire felt her face grow warm. Around her, other guests were already moving toward their assigned places, chairs scraping softly against the polished floor, laughter rising as friends reunited at their tables. She stood in the middle of the moving crowd like a stone in a river, and for one terrible second, she considered simply walking straight back out through the glass doors and driving home, before anyone noticed she had never truly arrived. "Is there anything you can do?" she asked, trying to keep the tremor out of her voice. The usher promised to check with the manager and disappeared into the crowd, leaving Claire standing near a marble pillar with her champagne glass now completely empty, and her hands with nothing left to hold on to. She watched dinner service begin around her. Waiters set down plates of food at every table but hers. Conversations rose into warm, easy laughter at every table but hers. She felt, for the first time that night, entirely and completely invisible, a woman standing in the middle of a celebration that did not include her. Minutes passed. The usher did not return. Claire pulled her phone from her clutch and checked for a message from Nora, finding nothing new. Only the earlier text about traffic, that now felt like it had been sent from another lifetime. She thought about leaving. She thought about the drive home, the empty apartment, the blanket on the sofa that she had specifically decided not to want tonight. She thought about how she would explain to Nora tomorrow that she had come, and stood, and then gone home before midnight, because there had been nowhere for her to sit. She was gathering the courage to walk toward the exit when she noticed, without quite meaning to, that someone at the long table near the center of the room was standing. At first she thought little of it. People stood at galas all the time, greeting friends, making toasts, moving between conversations. But this man did not sit back down. He remained standing, tall and composed, in a dark suit that fit him with the kind of precision that spoke of tailoring rather than luck, and his gaze was fixed, unmistakably, in her direction. Claire glanced behind her, certain he must be looking at someone else, certain there must be some other explanation for a stranger staring at her from across a crowded ballroom. But there was no one behind her, only the marble pillar and a waiter clearing an empty tray. When she turned back, the man was still watching her, and now he was walking, unhurried, cutting a straight path through the crowd toward where she stood frozen near the pillar. She had no idea, in that moment, that the man crossing the room toward her was the guest of honor at the entire evening, a man whose family had built half the wings of this very hotel, a man everyone in that room had come partly hoping to be noticed by. She only knew that a stranger with kind, serious eyes was walking straight toward her, and that her heart, already unsteady from the evening's disappointments, had begun to beat in a rhythm she did not recognize. He stopped a respectful distance from her and inclined his head slightly, the way a person greets someone they intend to treat with genuine courtesy rather than passing politeness. "Forgive me," he said, his voice low and steady beneath the music. "I could not help but notice you have been standing here for some time, without a place to sit. Has something gone wrong with your table?" Claire opened her mouth to answer, and found, for a moment, that no words would come. Up close, he was even more striking than he had appeared from across the room, with dark hair combed back neatly, and eyes the color of a stormy sea, calm on the surface, but holding something deeper underneath. She managed, finally, to explain the mistake with her booking, the vanished usher, the friend stuck in traffic, all of it tumbling out faster than she intended, as though the kindness of his question had loosened something she had been holding tightly all evening. He listened without interrupting, his expression growing more thoughtful with every word she spoke. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, studying her with an attention that made her feel, for the first time all night, that she was not invisible after all. "That will not do," he said simply. "No one should stand alone on a night like this." Claire did not yet understand what those words would come to mean for the rest of her life. She only knew that the loneliness she had carried into that ballroom, the same loneliness she had carried for 5 long years, had just been interrupted by a stranger who seemed determined not to let her carry it any further tonight. She did not know his name. She did not know that half the room was already watching the two of them with quiet, astonished curiosity. She only knew that for the first time since she had walked through those glass doors, she did not feel like a woman standing at the edge of a party that was never meant for her. She felt, instead, like a woman who had just been seen. The band shifted into a slower song somewhere behind them, and the stranger glanced briefly toward the long table at the center of the room, the one draped in white and gold, before looking back at her with an expression she could not quite read. Something in his face suggested he was making a decision, weighing a choice that mattered more than the simple courtesy of a conversation with a stranger. "Come with me," he said finally, and there was nothing demanding in his tone, only a quiet invitation. "I think I know where you belong tonight." Claire looked past him toward the long table, toward the empty chair beside his own that she had not yet noticed. and felt something inside her chest loosen for the first time in longer than she could remember. She did not know his name yet. She did not know he was a duke, or that the empty seat beside him was the most watched chair in the entire ballroom, or that the moment she took a single step to follow him would become the story she told for the rest of her life. She only knew that a stranger with storm-colored eyes had looked at her loneliness and decided, without hesitation, that it would not last another minute. She took the step, and the whole evening changed. Nora arrived 40 minutes later, breathless and apologetic, pushing through the crowd near the entrance with her coat still half off her shoulders, already composing the apology she planned to deliver. She scanned the ballroom for her friend, expecting to find Claire standing quietly near a wall somewhere, checking her phone, perhaps ready to leave. Instead, she found herself stopping completely still in the middle of the floor, staring toward the center of the room in disbelief. Claire was seated at the long table, beneath the banner of white and gold, laughing at something the man beside her had said, her green dress catching the light, her face brighter than Nora had seen it in years. Nora had no idea who the man was. She only knew, watching her friend from across the crowded ballroom, that something important had already begun, and that whatever had happened in the 40 minutes since she had left Claire alone at the entrance, it had changed everything. The night was only getting started. The chair beside him was still warm from being empty only a moment before, and Claire lowered herself into it, with the careful movements of someone who was not entirely convinced this was real. Around her, faces she did not recognize glanced her way with open curiosity, some polite, some less so. She felt the weight of their attention settle on her shoulders like a heavy coat she had not asked to wear, but the man beside her seemed entirely unbothered by the stares, as though such attention was simply the ordinary texture of his life. "I never asked your name," he said, turning toward her with a small, easy smile that softened the sharpness of his features. "Claire," she answered. "Claire Whitfield." "And I am Julian," he said, offering his hand. "Julian Ashford." The name meant nothing to her in that moment, and she shook his hand without any sense that she had just been introduced to one of the most recognized men in the entire hotel. It was only later, when a waiter addressed him with a formal title that made half the nearby tables straighten in their seats, that Claire understood there was more to this stranger than a kind gesture and a pair of storm-colored eyes. For now, she only knew that his hand was warm, his grip steady, and his attention entirely hers. "Thank you for this," she said quietly, glancing at the empty chair that had, only minutes before, seemed destined to remain empty all night. "I do not know what I would have done. You would have found somewhere to sit eventually," he said. "I simply saved you the trouble of looking." There was something in the way he said it, light and unassuming, that made Claire laugh despite herself. A real laugh, unguarded, the kind she had not allowed herself in longer than she wanted to admit. The sound seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her, and for a moment, his composed expression cracked into something warmer, something that looked almost like relief. Dinner arrived, plate after plate of food she barely tasted, because her attention kept drifting to the man beside her, to the careful way he spoke, to the questions he asked that seemed to actually want answers, rather than simply filling silence. He asked about her work, and she found herself describing the small design firm where she spent her days sketching layouts for buildings other people would eventually walk through, without ever knowing her name. He listened as though the details mattered, nodding at the parts that interested him, asking follow-up questions that showed he had truly heard what she said, rather than merely waiting for his turn to speak again. "You enjoy it," he said. "Building things people will use." "I like knowing something I imagined will exist somewhere," she admitted. "Even if no one remembers my name attached to it." "Someone should remember," he said simply, and something in his tone made her look up from her plate and meet his eyes directly for the first time since she had sat down. There was nothing performed in the way he looked at her, no practiced charm of the kind she had encountered before, from men who wanted something simple and temporary. His attention felt different, deliberate, as though he had decided she was worth truly seeing, rather than merely glancing past. She asked about him in return, carefully at first, unsure how much he wanted to share with a stranger he had rescued from an empty chair less than an hour earlier. He answered more openly than she expected, describing a life that from the outside looked like every advantage a person could ask for, and from the inside felt, he admitted quietly, remarkably similar to standing alone at the edge of a room. His father had died 2 years earlier, passing the weight of a family name and all its obligations onto shoulders that had not asked to carry them. His mother managed the family's affairs with a precision that left little room for him to make his own decisions, and every event like tonight's gala came wrapped in expectations he had grown tired of meeting. "I am supposed to be circulating," he admitted, glancing briefly toward the long table where several guests were watching the two of them with poorly disguised interest. "Greeting people who want something from my family's name. Instead, I am here, talking to the only person tonight who has not once mentioned my title." "I did not know you had one," Claire said honestly, and he laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to catch him off guard, as much as her earlier laugh had caught her. "That," he said, "might be the nicest thing anyone has said to me all year." The band shifted between songs, and around them the party continued its bright, loud celebration. But at their end of the long table, a smaller, quieter world had formed, one built entirely of conversation, and the slow discovery of two people who had each expected to spend this night feeling invisible. Claire found herself telling him things she had not told anyone in years, about the breakup that had left her wary of trusting easily, about the string of New Year's Eves spent alone that had convinced her loneliness might simply be a permanent feature of her life, rather than a passing season. "I understand that more than you might think," Julian said quietly. "Everyone assumes a man in my position cannot possibly be lonely. They see the house, the name, the money, and they think loneliness only belongs to people without those things. But a full room can be the emptiest place in the world if no one in it actually sees you." Claire looked at him for a long moment, weighing his words against the loneliness she had carried into this very ballroom only an hour earlier. "I think I understand that better than most people would guess," she said finally. They fell into an easier silence after that, one that did not need filling, and Claire realized with some surprise that she felt more comfortable in that silence, with a stranger she had known for less than 2 hours, than she had felt in months of conversation with people she had known for years. Nora appeared briefly at the edge of her vision, waving discreetly from across the room with an expression that mixed disbelief and delight in equal measure. But Claire barely registered her friend's arrival, entirely absorbed in the conversation unfolding beside her. As dinner service ended and the tables were cleared for dancing, Julian rose from his chair and extended his hand toward her, the same quiet, unassuming gesture that had brought her to this table in the first place. "Would you dance with me?" he asked. "I find I would rather not spend the rest of tonight talking to anyone else." Claire looked at his outstretched hand, at the storm-colored eyes waiting patiently for her answer, and felt the last of her earlier loneliness dissolve into something new and unfamiliar and entirely welcome. She placed her hand in his and let him lead her toward the floor, unaware that across the room, several guests were already whispering about the woman in the green dress, who had somehow captured the attention of a man who never danced at these events. A man who had spent the last 2 years attending galas like this one, with careful, practiced distance, and who tonight, for reasons no one in that room could explain, had not left her side once. Neither of them noticed the whispers. Neither of them noticed the time slipping past 10, then 11, then closer toward midnight. They noticed only each other, moving slowly across the floor, while the rest of the world spun on somewhere far outside the warm circle they had built for themselves in the middle of a crowded room. From across the dance floor, a woman in a silver gown watched Julian and Claire with narrowed eyes and a glass of champagne she had stopped drinking several minutes earlier. Her name was Victoria Hale, and she had known Julian since they were both children running through the halls of 2 neighboring estates, their families bound together by decades of friendship and, more recently, by an unspoken expectation that the two of them would eventually marry and unite what remained of both fortunes. Victoria had not expected a stranger in a green dress to complicate that expectation on the one night she had specifically chosen to remind Julian of everything they had built together. She set down her glass and made her way toward the edge of the dance floor, arranging her expression into something warm and unbothered, before Julian could notice she had been watching. But Claire noticed. She caught the flicker of tension pass across Julian's face the moment he spotted Victoria approaching. A subtle shift from ease into something more guarded, and she felt, for the first time since sitting down at that long table, the return of a small, familiar doubt. "Julian, darling," Victoria said, her voice pitched perfectly for the moment, warm enough to sound sincere, and sharp enough to make her meaning clear. "I hardly recognized you away from the family table. You have been quite occupied this evening." "This is Claire," Julian said evenly, his hand still resting lightly at Claire's waist. "Claire, this is Victoria. Our families have known each other for a long time." "How lovely," Victoria said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes, as she studied Claire from the top of her carefully styled hair to the hem of her green dress. "And how did the two of you meet?" "There was a small mistake with a table booking," Claire said, keeping her voice steady despite the way Victoria's gaze made her feel suddenly aware of every difference between them. The designer gown against her own carefully chosen dress. The confidence of someone who had never once worried about finding a seat at any table in her life. Julian was kind enough to help. "How very like him," Victoria said, and though the words were pleasant, something colder moved beneath them, a warning aimed not at Claire directly, but clearly meant for her to hear. Julian has always had a soft heart for people who need rescuing. Julian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and he guided Claire gently a half-step further from Victoria's orbit. "If you will excuse us," he said, his tone polite but final. "We were about to return to the dance." Victoria's smile did not waver, but her eyes tracked them as they moved away, and Claire felt the weight of that gaze on her back long after they had rejoined the rhythm of the music. Something about the exchange had unsettled her, not because of anything cruel Victoria had said outright, but because of everything she had implied without saying it at all. A soft heart for people who need rescuing. The words repeated themselves in Claire's mind even as Julian's hand found hers again and drew her back into the dance. "Do not let her trouble you," Julian said quietly, reading the change in Claire's expression with an attentiveness that surprised her. "Victoria says many things designed to unsettle people. It rarely means what she wants it to mean." "She seemed to think you and she were expected to be something to each other," Claire said carefully, watching his face for the truth beneath whatever answer he chose to give. Julian was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again his voice had lost some of its earlier lightness. "Our families have discussed it for years," he admitted. "It was never something I agreed to, only something that was assumed on my behalf, the way a great many things in my life have been assumed on my behalf without anyone thinking to ask me first." Claire absorbed this in silence, aware of how quickly the evening had shifted from simple gratitude into something far more complicated, something that carried the weight of families and expectations, and a woman in silver who clearly had no intention of stepping quietly aside. She thought of her own life, small and uncomplicated by comparison, built from nothing grander than hard work and the occasional disappointment, and wondered whether a man carrying the weight Julian carried could truly make room in it for someone like her. "You are thinking something you have not said," Julian observed, tilting his head slightly as the music slowed around them. "I am wondering if this is real," Claire admitted, surprising herself with her own honesty, "or if I am simply a pleasant distraction from a complicated night." Julian stopped moving entirely, his hand still resting at her waist, and looked at her with an intensity that made the noise of the party around them seem to fade into something distant and unimportant. "You are not a distraction," he said, each word deliberate and clear. "I have attended a dozen evenings like this one, surrounded by people who wanted something from my name, and I cannot remember the last time I felt as present in a conversation as I have felt tonight, talking with you. Whatever happens after tonight, I want you to know that much is true." Claire searched his face for any sign that his words were simply the practiced comfort of a man accustomed to smoothing over difficult moments, but she found none. What she found instead was something rawer, something that matched the loneliness she had recognized in him earlier, the loneliness of a person surrounded by expectation, but rarely truly seen. The band shifted into a new song, slower still, and around them, other couples drew closer, as the clock on the far wall crept steadily toward 11. Claire let herself relax back into the rhythm of the dance, allowing herself, for the moment, to set aside the questions Victoria's interruption had raised. There would be time enough later to wonder what tomorrow might bring. Tonight, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she simply wanted to stay exactly where she was. Across the room, Victoria returned to her seat at the family table and accepted a fresh glass of champagne from a passing waiter, her expression carefully composed into polite disinterest. But her eyes remained fixed on the dance floor, tracking the couple moving slowly beneath the chandeliers, and the calculations already forming behind her calm exterior had nothing polite about them at all. She had spent years positioning herself as the natural conclusion to Julian's story, and she had no intention of allowing one uninvited evening to undo what she considered already decided. Near the entrance of the ballroom, Julian's mother, Lady Eleanor Ashford, stood in quiet conversation with an old family friend, her attention drifting periodically toward her son and the unfamiliar young woman he had not once left standing alone since the moment dinner began. Lady Eleanor said nothing to her companion about what she observed, but her expression, composed and unreadable as always, held a question that would not be answered until well after midnight had come and gone. By the time 11 o'clock arrived, Nora had finally managed to make her way to Claire's side, pulling her gently toward a quiet corner near the tall windows, while Julian was momentarily called away by an older gentleman, eager to discuss some matter of family business. Nora's eyes were wide with a mixture of excitement and disbelief as she gripped Claire's hands. "Do you have any idea who that is?" Nora whispered urgently. "Claire, that is Julian Ashford. His family owns half this hotel and half the county besides. People do not simply dance with him for 2 hours. People spend entire careers trying to get 5 minutes of his attention." "I did not know any of that when I sat down," Claire said honestly, glancing toward where Julian stood in polite conversation, his posture straight and formal now, in a way it had not been while dancing with her. "He was kind to me when I had nowhere to sit. That is all I knew." Nora studied her friend's face carefully, the way old friends do when they are searching for signs of trouble before trouble has fully arrived. "And how do you feel now?" she asked. Claire considered the question honestly before answering. "Frightened," she admitted. "Not of him, of how quickly everything feels different than it did 3 hours ago. I do not know how someone like him fits into a life like mine, or if he even wants to. There was a woman here earlier, Victoria, who made it very clear she believes she already knows how this story is supposed to end, and it does not end with someone like me still standing in the room." Nora's expression softened with the particular sympathy of a friend who has watched someone she loves carry disappointment quietly for years. "Listen to me," she said firmly. "You have spent 5 New Year's Eves alone because you convinced yourself loneliness was simply your permanent condition, something to be managed rather than something that could change. Do not let one woman in a silver dress convince you of that story again before the night is even over. Whatever happens tomorrow, tonight he chose you. That is not nothing." Claire nodded slowly, letting her friend's words settle over the doubt Victoria had planted, though she could not fully shake the sense that something larger than a single evening's kindness was now unfolding around her, something with roots and history and expectations she did not yet understand. She glanced back toward Julian, who caught her eye across the room, even while still engaged in his conversation, and offered her a small, private smile that seemed to say the discussion he was trapped in meant nothing compared to the one he intended to return to. When he finally extracted himself and made his way back to her side, he apologized for the interruption with a weariness that suggested such interruptions were simply the unavoidable texture of his life. "Family friends," he explained. "They enjoy reminding me of obligations I have not forgotten." Claire wanted to ask him more, about Victoria, about the expectations Nora had described, about what exactly it meant for a man like him to spend an entire evening at the side of a woman he had met only hours earlier over an empty chair. But something in his expression, tired now beneath the composure, made her hesitate. Instead, she simply asked if he would like some air, and together they slipped through a side door onto a quiet balcony overlooking the city, leaving the noise of the party muffled behind them. The night outside was cold and clear, and below them the city stretched out in 1,000 small lights, each window holding its own private story of celebration or loneliness, or something in between. Julian leaned against the stone railing and let out a slow breath, the first fully relaxed movement Claire had seen from him since Victoria's interruption. "I am sorry about earlier," he said. "Victoria means well, in her way, though it rarely feels that way from the outside. My mother has hoped for years that Victoria and I would eventually settle the matter between our families properly. I have never wanted what she wants, but wanting something different has never been quite enough to end the conversation." "What do you want?" Claire asked quietly, watching the lights below rather than his face, giving him room to answer honestly without the pressure of her gaze. Julian was silent for a long moment, long enough that Claire wondered if he intended to answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, stripped of the polished composure he wore so easily in front of others. "I want to stop living a life other people have already written for me," he said. "I want, for once, to choose something because it makes me feel like myself, rather than because it fulfills an obligation I never agreed to. Tonight, watching you stand alone near that pillar, and then talking with you for the last 3 hours, is the first time in longer than I can remember that I have felt like I was choosing something rather than simply enduring it." Claire turned to look at him then, and found him already watching her, his expression open in a way that made the cold night air feel suddenly warm. She understood, standing there on that quiet balcony, with the city glittering below them, that whatever this was becoming, it had already moved beyond a simple kindness, extended to a stranger without a seat. It had become something neither of them had expected to find on a night they had both, in their own separate ways, been dreading. "I should tell you," Claire said softly, "that I do not know how to do this. I do not know how someone like me is supposed to fit into a world like yours, with families who plan marriages over dinner, and women in silver dresses who already believe they know how the story ends." Julian reached out and gently took her hand, his thumb tracing slowly across her knuckles. "Then perhaps," he said, "we simply write a different story than the one everyone expects. One neither of us has read before." Below them, faintly through the glass doors, they could hear the crowd inside beginning to count down the final minutes of the year, voices rising together in anticipation of midnight. Claire felt her heart quicken, not from nerves this time, but from something warmer, something that felt dangerously close to hope. Julian's hand tightened gently around hers, and neither of them moved to return inside, content instead to stand together on that balcony, as the old year prepared to end, and something new, fragile and uncertain, began to take its place. The count reached 10, and Julian pulled Claire gently back toward the glass doors, guiding her inside, just as the crowd's voices rose together in a single unified chant that shook the chandeliers overhead. 9, 8, 7. Around them, the ballroom had transformed into a sea of raised glasses and joined hands, every face turned upward in anticipation, every heart in that vast room beating toward the same fragile hope that a new year might somehow undo the disappointments of the old one. 6, 5, 4. Claire found herself standing at the center of the crowd beside Julian, his hand still holding hers. The two of them swept into the current of celebration, despite everything that had happened in the hours leading up to this moment. She thought, briefly, of the woman who had stood alone near the marble pillar only a few hours earlier, invisible and forgotten, and marveled at how completely that woman seemed to belong to a different night entirely. 3, 2. Julian turned to face her fully, his storm-colored eyes holding hers, with an intensity that made the noise of the countdown fade into something distant and unimportant. "Whatever happens after tonight," he said quietly, close enough that only she could hear him over the roar of the crowd, "I am glad it began with you." 1. The room erupted into cheers, confetti falling in golden showers from somewhere above, the band launching into a bright, triumphant song that sent couples spinning across the floor in celebration. Julian leaned forward slowly, giving Claire every opportunity to step back if she wished, and when she did not, he pressed a gentle kiss to her lips that tasted faintly of champagne, and felt, to Claire, like the answer to a question she had been carrying for 5 long years without knowing how to ask it. Around them, the world continued its bright, loud celebration, entirely unaware that in the middle of the crowd, two people who had both expected to spend this night feeling forgotten had instead found something neither of them had dared to hope for. When they finally parted, Claire found herself laughing softly, half from happiness and half from the sheer improbability of the entire evening, the champagne glass she had been holding earlier now forgotten somewhere on a table, replaced by something far more intoxicating. "Happy New Year," Julian said softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face with a tenderness that made her chest ache in the best possible way. "Happy New Year," she echoed, and meant it more fully than she had meant those words in longer than she could remember. They stayed on the dance floor as the celebration swirled around them, and for a while it seemed as though nothing could touch the small, warm world they had built together in the middle of that crowded ballroom. But Claire noticed, over Julian's shoulder, Lady Eleanor watching them from near the family table, with an expression that had shifted from quiet observation into something more deliberate, more assessing, and Victoria, standing beside her, with her arms crossed, and her jaw set in a way that suggested the evening's surprises were far from finished. Julian noticed the direction of Claire's gaze, and turned briefly to follow it, his own expression tightening slightly, before he guided her attention back to him with a gentle touch to her cheek. "Do not worry about them tonight," he said. "Tonight belongs to us. Tomorrow we can worry about everyone else's opinions." But Claire could not entirely set the worry aside, not when she had already witnessed how quickly Victoria's warmth could turn cold, not when Lady Eleanor's careful, unreadable expression suggested a woman already calculating the shape of a problem she intended to solve. Still, she allowed herself, for the remainder of that night, to hold on to the warmth of Julian's hand and the memory of his kiss, rather than the uncertainty waiting somewhere beyond the ballroom's glittering doors. They talked until nearly 2 a.m, long after most of the other guests had begun drifting toward the exits, exchanging numbers and addresses and small confessions about the years that had led each of them to this particular midnight. Claire told him about her father, who had left when she was young, and how it had taught her early that people could not always be relied upon to stay. Julian told her about the accident that had taken his father 2 years earlier, and how the sudden weight of a title he had never wanted had left him feeling like a stranger in his own life ever since. "We are both looking for the same thing," Julian said quietly, as the last of the band's instruments were being packed away around them. "Someone to make the empty rooms feel less empty." Claire thought of all the New Year's Eves she had spent believing that emptiness was simply her permanent condition, and looked at the man beside her, who had crossed an entire crowded ballroom simply because he could not bear to watch her stand alone. "I think," she said softly, "we might have already found it." When Nora finally collected her near the coat check at 2:30, exhausted but glowing, with an excitement she had not felt on Claire's behalf in years, Claire glanced back one final time, to where Julian stood watching her leave, his expression carrying a warmth that promised this was only a beginning, rather than an ending. He had already asked to see her again, had already made arrangements to call the following week, and Claire drove home that night through empty, quiet streets with a lightness in her chest she had almost forgotten was possible to feel. She had no way of knowing, as she climbed into bed just before dawn, with her green dress hung carefully over her chair, and the memory of Julian's kiss still warm on her lips, that the following weeks would bring both the greatest joy she had known in years, and a series of challenges that would test whether the connection they had found on that snow-dusted New Year's Eve could survive the world both of them would have to return to, when morning finally, fully arrived. 3 days passed before Julian called, and Claire spent every one of them convincing herself she had imagined the entire evening that a man in his position could not possibly have meant the things he said while standing beside her on that cold balcony. She was seated at her desk at the design firm, sketching the outline of a building she had little enthusiasm for that afternoon, when her phone finally lit up with a number she did not recognize. "I hope this is not too soon," Julian said, and the sound of his voice, warm and slightly uncertain in a way she had not heard from him during the confident hours of the party, sent a wave of relief through her chest that she had not realized she was holding. "It is not too soon," she said, smiling despite herself at the curious glances from a coworker across the room. They spoke for nearly an hour that afternoon, and again the following evening, and by the end of the week Julian had arranged to meet her for dinner at a small restaurant far from the grand hotels and family estates that defined the rest of his life. A quiet place, with candles on the tables, and no chandeliers overhead at all. Claire arrived nervous, half expecting the easy warmth between them to have been a product of champagne and midnight magic, rather than something that could survive the ordinary light of a Tuesday evening. Instead, she found Julian waiting for her at a corner table, standing the moment she walked through the door, and the warmth in his eyes when he saw her told her everything she needed to know. The following weeks unfolded like a season Claire had never experienced before, full of quiet dinners and long conversations, and the slow, careful building of trust between two people who had each learned, in their own ways, to expect disappointment rather than joy. Julian took her to a small gallery she had mentioned once in passing, remembering the detail weeks later in a way that surprised her. She brought him to the tiny cafe near her apartment, where she had spent countless lonely evenings, with nothing but a book for company, and watched him fall in love with the same simple comfort that had sustained her through years of solitude. But even as their connection deepened, the world outside their quiet dinners had not forgotten who Julian was, or the expectations that came attached to his name. Photographs of the two of them together began appearing in society pages within weeks. Grainy images captured outside restaurants or during walks through the park, accompanied by speculation about the identity of the woman who had captured the attention of one of the city's most eligible and most private men. Claire found herself, for the first time in her ordinary life, the subject of a curiosity she had never asked for and did not know how to manage. Nora sat with her one evening as she scrolled through an article speculating about her background, her income, her suitability for a man of Julian's standing, written by someone who had clearly never spoken to either of them directly. "This is exhausting," Claire admitted, setting her phone face down on the table. "I did not sign up to have strangers debate whether I deserve to be happy." "You did not sign up for any of this," Nora said gently. "But from everything you have told me, he has not once made you feel like you needed to earn a place beside him. That matters more than what strangers write in magazines." Claire knew her friend was right, and yet the weight of outside opinion pressed steadily harder against the fragile new happiness she had found. It came to a head one evening when Julian invited her to a small family dinner at his mother's estate, a gathering he described as low-key and informal, though nothing about the grand stone house Claire arrived at that evening felt small in any sense of the word. Lady Eleanor greeted her at the door with impeccable manners and an expression that gave away nothing of her true feelings, ushering Claire into a dining room set with more silverware than Claire had ever used in a single meal. Daria was there as well, seated across the table with the easy confidence of someone entirely at home in these surroundings, engaging Lady Eleanor in conversation about mutual friends and upcoming events that Claire had no context for and no way to contribute to. Claire did her best to follow along, answering questions about her work and her family with as much composure as she could manage, aware the entire time of Lady Eleanor's careful, assessing gaze moving over her throughout the meal. After dinner, while Julian was called away briefly to take a phone call regarding some family matter, Lady Eleanor invited Claire to join her on the terrace for what she described as a private word between the two of them. Claire followed, her stomach tight with a nervousness she recognized from every job interview and difficult conversation she had ever endured, sensing that whatever Lady Eleanor intended to say would matter a great deal to everything that followed. "You must understand," Lady Eleanor began once they were alone. "My son has responsibilities that extend far beyond his own happiness. Our family's name carries weight in circles you may not fully appreciate. Weight that has been built and protected across many generations. I do not say this to diminish you, Miss Whitfield. I say it because I have watched my son grow increasingly attached to you in a very short time, and I would be failing him as his mother if I did not ask whether you fully understand what you are entering into." Claire held Lady Eleanor's gaze steadily despite the tremor she felt building in her chest. "I understand that I love spending time with your son," she said carefully. "I understand that he makes me feel more like myself than I have felt in years. I do not know everything that comes with his name, but I am willing to learn if he is willing to have me beside him while I do." Lady Eleanor studied her for a long moment, her expression unreadable in the dim evening light. "Willingness is not always enough," she said finally. "There are pressures in this life that have broken far stronger women than you, Miss Whitfield, women who came from families far better prepared for this world than yours. I only hope, for both your sakes, that you have considered this fully before allowing my son's attention to become something neither of you can easily undo." The warning hung in the cold evening air between them, and Claire felt, for the first time since that magical midnight 3 weeks earlier, the full weight of everything she had not yet had to consider. She had fallen in love with Julian the man, the person who had crossed a crowded ballroom, simply because he could not bear to watch her stand alone. She had not yet fully reckoned with everything that came bound to his name, the expectations, the scrutiny, the women like Victoria who had spent years preparing for a life Claire had stumbled into by pure accident of an empty chair. When Julian returned to find them both standing quietly on the terrace, he glanced between his mother's composed expression and Claire's carefully guarded one, sensing immediately that something significant had passed between them in his absence. "Is everything all right?" he asked, moving to stand beside Claire with a protectiveness that did not go unnoticed by either woman present. "Everything is fine," Lady Eleanor said smoothly, offering Claire a small, formal smile before turning to head back inside. "I was simply getting to know your guest a little better." But as Julian walked Claire to her car later that night, his hand warm around hers, Claire could not shake the feeling that Lady Eleanor's words had planted a seed of doubt that would not be easily uprooted. A question about whether love built on the foundation of one magical midnight could truly survive the weight of everything neither of them had yet been forced to face together. The doubt Lady Eleanor had planted grew slowly over the following weeks, watered by every small reminder of the gap between Claire's world and Julian's. She noticed it in the way certain shop assistants treated her differently, once photographs of her with Julian began circulating more widely, in the way old acquaintances suddenly wanted to reconnect, in the exhausting weight of strangers online debating her worth in comment sections she had learned, too late, never to read. She noticed it most sharply one afternoon when Victoria appeared unannounced at the small cafe near Claire's apartment, sliding into the seat across from her with the composed confidence of someone who had clearly planned this encounter carefully. "I thought we should talk," Victoria said, setting her handbag down with deliberate precision, woman to woman, without Julian or his mother listening. Claire set down her coffee cup carefully, unsure what to expect from this unexpected visit. "I am listening," she said evenly. "I am not here to be cruel," Victoria said, though something in her tone suggested otherwise. "I am here because I do not think you fully understand what you are walking into. Julian's family has weathered scandals before, Miss Whitfield, and they have always found a way to protect what matters most to them. I have known this family my entire life. I know what they value, what they will tolerate, and what they will not. A whirlwind romance that began because of an empty chair makes for a charming story in the tabloids, but it will not survive the reality of what comes next, the events, the obligations, the constant scrutiny that never, ever stops." "You sound very certain of how this will end," Claire said, keeping her voice steady despite the anxiety building in her chest. "I have watched this family for 20 years, Victoria said simply. "I am certain because I have seen this pattern before. Julian falls for someone new and unexpected, someone who makes him feel free of his obligations for a little while, and eventually, the weight of those obligations returns and crushes whatever he built in the meantime. I do not say this to hurt you. I say it because I do not want to watch you get hurt worse than you already will be." Victoria left as abruptly as she had arrived, and Claire sat alone at the small cafe table, long after her coffee had gone cold, turning the conversation over in her mind with growing unease. She wanted desperately to dismiss Victoria's words as nothing more than jealousy dressed up as concern, but the truth was that every word had echoed the same warnings Lady Eleanor had offered weeks earlier, and the accumulation of two separate warnings from two very different women left Claire with a doubt she could no longer easily set aside. That evening, when Julian arrived at her apartment for their planned dinner, he found her quieter than usual, distracted in a way he noticed immediately despite her attempts to hide it. "What is wrong?" he asked gently, taking her hands across the small kitchen table where she had barely touched the meal she prepared. Claire hesitated, unsure how to voice the fear that had been building steadily for weeks, without sounding as though she doubted him directly. "Your mother warned me, weeks ago, that pressures like these have broken stronger women than me," she finally admitted. "And today Victoria told me she has watched this pattern before, watched you fall for someone new, and then watched the weight of your obligations eventually crush whatever you built together. I am trying very hard not to believe them, Julian, but I do not know how to stop being afraid that they might be right." Julian's expression tightened, and he was quiet for a long moment before responding, choosing his words with visible care. "My mother and Victoria have both spent years building a version of my life that suits their own comfort," he said finally. "I cannot promise you that the pressures they describe are imaginary, because they are not. There will be scrutiny, there will be moments when my obligations pull me away from where I would rather be, but I can promise you that I have never once, in the weeks since that New Year's Eve, regretted choosing you over the version of my life everyone else had already written for me." "That is easy to say tonight," Claire said quietly, "and I believe you mean it. But I am afraid of what happens on the night it stops being easy." Julian reached across the table and took her hand fully in his thumb tracing gently across her knuckles the way it had on that first cold balcony. "Then let us find out together," he said. "I am not asking you to trust my mother's version of how this ends, or Victoria's. I am asking you to trust what we have actually built these past weeks, the two of us, without their voices in the room." Claire wanted, desperately, to simply say yes, and let the warning voices fade into the background of a happiness she had not expected to find. But the seed of doubt had grown too large to dismiss so easily, and over the following days it continued to grow, fed by every new photograph in the society pages, every whispered comment from strangers who recognized her now on the street, every reminder that the world Julian belonged to had never fully welcomed her and might never learn to. 2 weeks later, matters came to a difficult point when Julian was called away to attend an important family gathering, an annual event bringing together the most prominent families in the region, an event Claire was pointedly not invited to attend. Julian explained apologetically that the guest list had been fixed for years before either of them had met, that his mother controlled the invitations entirely, and that he intended to raise the matter directly with her before the following year's gathering. But the exclusion, however logical its explanation, landed with painful weight on Claire's already fragile confidence, confirming every fear Lady Eleanor and Victoria had planted in the weeks since that magical midnight. Standing alone in her apartment on the night of the gathering, watching from her phone as photographs began appearing online of the grand event unfolding without her, Claire felt the old, familiar loneliness she had carried for 5 long years begin creeping back into the edges of her chest, whispering that perhaps this had always been destined to happen, that perhaps some rooms simply were not meant to hold a place for her, no matter how kindly someone once stood up and gestured toward an empty chair. Julian called her twice that night from the gathering, and both times Claire let the call ring through to silence, unable to find the words she needed to explain the storm building inside her, without sounding as though she was blaming him for circumstances he had not chosen. When he finally arrived at her apartment near midnight, still dressed in the formal attire of the event he had left early against his mother's clear displeasure, Claire opened the door to find him looking more exhausted than she had ever seen him. "I am sorry," he said immediately, before she could speak at all. "I should have fought harder to have you included. I should have told my mother the guest list was unacceptable, rather than simply apologizing to you and hoping it would be enough." Claire stepped back to let him inside, her earlier anger softened somewhat by the visible weight of his own frustration. "It is not just about tonight," she said quietly, once they were both seated on her small sofa. "It is about every night like tonight that is still to come. Your mother has made it very clear she does not consider me suitable for the life you are meant to lead. Victoria has made it very clear she believes this is simply a phase you will eventually move past. And I am starting to wonder if they are seeing something true that I have been too happy to notice." "They are seeing what they want to see," Julian said firmly, but there was less certainty in his voice than there had been weeks earlier, and Claire noticed it immediately. "Are they?" she asked. "Or are they seeing that loving me will always mean fighting your own family, always mean smaller versions of your life, always mean events I am not invited to, and rooms I do not belong in? I do not want to be someone you have to fight for every single day, Julian. I have spent enough of my life fighting simply to be seen. I do not know if I have the strength to spend the rest of it fighting simply to be accepted by people who have already decided I am not enough." Julian was quiet for a long moment, his hands clasped tightly together, his expression carrying a weight Claire had not seen from him since that very first night, when he had described feeling like a stranger in his own life. "I cannot promise you my mother will change her mind easily," he finally said. "I cannot promise Victoria will simply step aside gracefully, or that the scrutiny will lessen, or that every event will welcome you exactly as you deserve to be welcomed. What I can promise is that I am done allowing other people to write the story of my own happiness. I chose you that night because for the first time in years, I felt like myself, rather than a name attached to obligations I never asked for. That has not changed, no matter how difficult tonight was." Claire studied his face carefully, searching for any sign of hesitation beneath his words, and found instead the same steady conviction that had first crossed a crowded ballroom, simply because he could not bear to watch her stand alone. But conviction alone, she knew, might not be enough to withstand the sustained pressure of a family and a world determined to see her fail. "I need time," she said finally, the words costing her more than she expected them to. "Not away from you, but away from all of this, from your mother's warnings, and Victoria's predictions, and photographers waiting outside restaurants. I need to know if what we have can exist on its own, without everyone else's voices constantly telling us what it is supposed to mean." Julian nodded slowly, though the hurt in his expression was clear despite his effort to hide it. "Whatever you need," he said quietly. "I am not going anywhere, Claire. but I understand if you need space to be certain of your own heart before you can be certain of mine." He left shortly after, and Claire spent the following week in careful, deliberate solitude, turning down his calls, not from anger, but from a genuine need to sit with her own feelings without the noise of his family's expectations pressing constantly against her judgment. She spoke with Nora at length, walked for hours through quiet parks, turning the entire situation over in her mind, and found herself, more than once, standing at her window at night, thinking of that first evening, of the empty chair, of the moment a stranger had crossed a crowded room, simply because her loneliness had caught his attention, and he had refused to let it continue even one moment longer. She thought of Lady Eleanor's warning that pressures like these had broken stronger women than her, and found, to her own surprise, that the warning no longer frightened her the way it once had. She had survived 5 lonely New Year's Eves, believing herself unworthy of a seat at any table worth sitting at. She had survived a father who left, a heartbreak that had taught her caution, years of quietly managing a loneliness she had convinced herself was simply permanent. If she had survived all of that, she was not entirely certain Lady Eleanor's disapproval, however formidable, was truly the thing that would finally break her. What she needed to know, she realized slowly over that quiet week of reflection, was not whether she could survive Julian's world. She needed to know whether she wanted to fight for a place in it. Not because Julian asked her to, and not despite what his mother and Victoria believed, but because she herself had decided the version of happiness she had found with him was worth the difficulty of building it. By the end of that week, sitting alone in her apartment, with the city lights glittering faintly beyond her window, Claire finally understood the answer she had been searching for, and reached for her phone to call the one person who had stood up in a crowded room and refused to let her remain invisible. Julian arrived at her apartment within the hour, his expression cautious with hope he was clearly trying not to let show too plainly. Claire opened the door and found herself smiling despite the seriousness of the conversation ahead of them, comforted simply by the familiar sight of him standing there, uncertain in a way that suited him better than the practiced composure he wore in front of the world. "I have been thinking all week," Claire said, inviting him inside, "and I do not want you to think I am asking you to abandon your family, or to fight every battle for me alone. I am asking whether you are truly ready to build a life that includes me completely, publicly, without hiding pieces of it away to keep your mother comfortable. Because I have decided I want to fight for this, but only if you are fighting beside me, rather than simply apologizing for a world you have not yet decided to change." Julian took both her hands in his relief plain across his face. "I spoke with my mother 3 days ago," he said. "I told her that whatever her hopes for Victoria and me had once been, they ended the night I met you, and that if she wished to remain close to me going forward, she would need to make room for the woman I love, rather than the woman she had already chosen on my behalf." Claire's breath caught at the word he had used so simply, so directly, without ceremony or hesitation. "You love me," she said quietly, more statement than question. "I have loved you since that balcony," Julian said. "I was only waiting for the courage to say it clearly, without letting my family's expectations complicate something that has always felt, to me, remarkably simple." Claire felt tears gathering that she did not try to hide. The accumulated weight of 5 lonely years, and 1 difficult week, finally beginning to loosen inside her chest. "I love you too," she said, and meant it with a certainty that no warning from Lady Eleanor or prediction from Victoria could touch. But love, they both understood, would not be enough on its own to resolve everything still ahead of them. 2 weeks later, Julian arranged a dinner, not at his mother's grand estate this time, but at neutral ground, a quiet restaurant where he intended to speak with Lady Eleanor directly, with Claire present, refusing any longer to let conversations about his future happen without her in the room. Lady Eleanor arrived precisely on time, her expression composed as always, though something in the set of her shoulders suggested she understood this dinner carried more weight than the family gatherings that had come before it. "Mother," Julian began once they were all seated, "I love Claire, and I intend to build my life with her, publicly and completely. I understand you have concerns about how the world will receive that decision, and I am willing to discuss those concerns honestly, but I am not willing to discuss whether Claire has a place in my future. That question has already been answered." Lady Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, studying Claire with the same assessing gaze she had used on the terrace weeks earlier. though something in her expression had shifted subtly since that first difficult conversation. "I have watched you these past months, Miss Whitfield," she finally said. "I confess I expected the pressure of this world to have driven you away by now. Most women in your position would have found it easier to simply retreat." "I considered it," Claire admitted honestly. "I am not going to pretend the past few weeks were easy, or that I do not still feel out of place at times in rooms full of people who have known this world their entire lives. But I have also spent 5 years believing loneliness was simply my permanent condition, and I am not willing to walk away from the first genuine happiness I have found in longer than I can remember, simply because it comes with challenges I did not expect." Lady Eleanor's expression softened, almost imperceptibly, into something that was not quite warmth, but was no longer entirely guarded either. "Perhaps," she said slowly, "I have been protecting the wrong thing all along. I have spent years protecting this family's name and its expectations, and rather less time considering whether my son was actually happy within the life I had built for him. I will not pretend I have no concerns remaining, but I am willing to make room for the possibility that I have misjudged the situation." It was not a full embrace, not yet, but it was a beginning, and Claire understood, watching Lady Eleanor's carefully guarded expression begin to thaw across the dinner table, that some victories arrived gradually rather than all at once, built one honest conversation at a time, rather than one in a single decisive moment. Victoria's reaction, when she eventually learned of Julian's public declaration of his intentions, proved less gracious, though even her sharp edges softened somewhat over the following months, as it became clear the matter was truly settled and no longer worth the energy of continued opposition. She and Claire would never become close friends, but they eventually reached a wary, functional peace, built on the mutual understanding that Julian's heart had already chosen its direction, long before either of them had any say in the matter. As autumn gave way to winter, Claire found herself, for the first time in her adult life, genuinely looking forward to the approaching holiday season, rather than dreading the loneliness it had always represented. Julian had already begun planning something for the following New Year's Eve, though he remained characteristically vague about the details whenever Claire pressed him for information, offering only a small, private smile that suggested he was already imagining exactly how he wanted this next chapter of their story to unfold. A full year had passed since Claire stood alone near a marble pillar, watching a room full of strangers celebrate a happiness she believed did not include her. Now, dressed in a deep blue gown instead of the green one she had worn that first night, she stood once again in the entrance of the same grand ballroom, the same chandeliers glittering overhead, the same band warming up somewhere near the far wall. But everything else about the evening felt entirely different, and Claire found herself smiling at the memory of the frightened, lonely woman who had walked through these same doors 12 months earlier, unaware that her life was about to change completely. This time, there was no confusion at the entrance, no usher delivering apologetic news about a missing reservation, no long, humiliating wait near the edge of the room while other people's happiness unfolded around her. This time, Julian was waiting for her just inside the doors, dressed in the same dark, precisely tailored suit he had worn that first night, his storm-colored eyes finding hers the moment she stepped inside. "You look exactly as you did the night I first saw you," he said, taking her hand and pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Only now you are smiling, instead of searching the room for somewhere to disappear." "I have somewhere to disappear to now," Claire said softly, glancing toward the long table at the center of the room, the same one draped this year in silver and white, where a chair sat waiting beside Julian's own place, reserved specifically and unmistakably for her. Lady Eleanor greeted Claire warmly when they reached the table, the guarded formality of their first difficult conversation, long since replaced by a genuine, if still occasionally reserved, fondness that had grown steadily over the past year. Victoria was there as well, seated further down the table beside a gentleman Claire had not met before, someone Victoria had begun seeing quietly over the past several months, and though their peace remained more practical than warm, it had settled comfortably enough that Claire no longer felt the old anxiety whenever Victoria's gaze happened to drift her way. Nora arrived on time this year, no traffic delays standing between her and the celebration, and she embraced Claire warmly before taking her seat at a nearby table with a date of her own, glancing frequently toward Claire and Julian throughout the evening, with the quiet satisfaction of a friend who had watched an entire love story unfold from its very first uncertain chapter. As dinner service concluded, and the tables were cleared for dancing, Julian rose from his chair, and for one brief, dizzying moment, Claire felt her heart leap with the memory of that very first gesture, the moment a stranger had stood up in a crowded room and refused to let her loneliness continue even one moment longer. But this time, instead of simply extending his hand toward the dance floor, Julian lowered himself onto one knee beside their table, and the entire room around them seemed to hold its breath in unison. "A year ago tonight," he said, his voice carrying clearly despite its quiet steadiness, "I watched a woman stand alone in this very room, and something in me refused to let another moment pass without doing something about it. I did not know, when I crossed this floor, that I was walking toward the rest of my life. I only knew I could not bear to watch you stand there unseen for one more second. Claire Whitfield, you have taught me more about genuine happiness in 1 year than I learned in 3 decades of living exactly the life everyone else expected of me. I do not want to simply give you a seat at my table anymore. I want to give you a permanent place in my life, for every year that follows this one." He opened a small box, and the ring inside caught the chandelier light in a way that seemed, to Claire, to echo the same golden glow that had filled the ballroom the night they first met. Around them, the room had gone completely silent. Every guest turned toward their table, waiting. Claire felt tears gathering, the same overwhelming mixture of joy and disbelief she had felt exactly 1 year earlier, when a stranger had gestured toward an empty chair and changed the entire direction of her life. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking slightly on the single word. "Yes, completely, and without any hesitation at all." The ballroom erupted into applause as Julian slid the ring onto her finger and rose to pull her into an embrace. And somewhere beyond the noise and the celebration, the band began playing the very same slow song that had accompanied their first dance 1 full year earlier. Julian led her onto the floor as the clock crept steadily toward midnight, and Claire, wrapped in his arms beneath the same chandeliers that had once witnessed her deepest loneliness, understood fully, for the first time in her life, what it truly meant to belong somewhere completely. As the countdown began once more, the whole room rising together in anticipation of a new year, Claire thought back to the frightened woman who had stood near that marble pillar 12 months earlier, convinced that loneliness was simply a permanent condition she would carry for the rest of her life. She wished, briefly and gently, that she could reach back through time and tell that woman everything that was coming. The kindness of a stranger, the courage to fight for something worth having, the family that would eventually open its arms, and the love that had proven, in the end, far stronger than any warning or doubt that had ever stood in its way. 3, 2, 1. The room exploded into cheers and falling confetti, and Julian pulled Claire close, pressing his lips gently to hers as the new year arrived around them. Golden light and warm laughter, and the promise of everything still ahead. "Happy New Year," he whispered against her lips, and Claire, finally and completely certain of exactly where she belonged, smiled and echoed the words back to him, knowing that never again would she have to wonder whether there was a seat for her in this world, because she had found not just a chair beside a stranger, but a permanent place beside the man she loved, for every new year still waiting to come.